Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and on today's episode of Adventures in Surplus, we are taking a look at a really cool early Finnish M28 Mosin. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the detailed, specific history of this rifle that can be determined just from the markings on it. And like many Finnish rifles, there's a tremendous amount of detail and depth that we can get into once we understand what we're looking at with the markings on this rifle. So the short version here, if you're not familiar with the M28, it was an improvement to the original Russian M91 Mosins. That rifle is basically formed the basis of Finnish military armaments in the 1920s. When Finland got its independence from the Russian Empire, they inherited a bunch of M91 Mosins. That became the standard rifle for the Finnish Army, or the Finnish Defense Forces, as well as the Finnish Civil Guard, which was a volunteer a volunteer sort of national defense, territorial defense, National Guard type of organization. By the mid to late 1920s, both the Army and the Civil Guards were getting kind of tired of using M91 Mosins. They're kind of the worst standard bolt-action rifle out there from the World War I era, and both organizations independently, or mostly independently, developed their own improved patterns. For the Finnish Army, this was the M27, and for the Finnish Civil Guards, it was the M28. They look pretty similar because they both came to the same conclusion about barrel length, which was shorten it to 27 inches. But there are a number of differences between the two rifles. The Civil Guards were starting to do quite a lot of competitive shooting, and they incorporated lessons and ideals from competitive target shooting into their model of Mosin Nagant. So it has a sort of free-floated barrel. We'll touch on that in a moment. This one's got a cool early windage adjustable sight, and a number of other modifications. But let's go ahead and take a closer look, and let's start talking about where this rifle actually came from. Since you're watching this video, you're probably interested in Finnish small arms, and so you should definitely check out my brand new book, Forged in Snow, Finnish Small Arms 1917 through 2025, currently on pre-sale over on Kickstarter. We've got a bunch of stretch goals, a bunch of cool pledge options, different versions of the book, tons of fun stuff. Definitely check it out. There's a link in the description text below. There are two initial misconceptions that I want to cover before we really dig into this rifle, because they're relevant to its history. So the first is, people assume Finland must have made a lot of Mosin Nagants because this was their standard rifle for, until after World War II. The reality is, Finland never manufactured a single Mosin Nagant receiver. In fact, they didn't really make any of the really complicated parts. Finland made some small parts. They made elements of the sights, they made stocks, they made furniture, barrel bands, sling swivels, that kind of thing. But they didn't manufacture, notably, bolts, magazines, or receivers. All of those components came from existing guns. And that leads us to the second misconception, which is that Finland captured a ton of Mosin Nagants from the Russians and rebuilt them as their own. Well, they did do that to some extent, but most of the Finnish Mosin Nagants were in Finnish hands before the Winter War in 1939. So yes, the Finns inherited a fair number of Mosins from the Russian Empire when it collapsed in 1917 and Finland got its independence, but most of Finland's Mosin Nagant parts and receivers actually came from purchases that Finland made on the international surplus market during the 1920s and the 1930s. They went on like a 15-year-long buying spree to get all the Mosin Nagant bits that they could. And they got a ton. Conveniently for the Finns, the Mosin Nagant wasn't really that great of a rifle compared to all of the alternatives out there, and nobody was really that interested in maintaining the Mosin as their standard pattern of rifle. People were way more interested in Mausers, primarily, and so Finland was able to buy Mosin Nagants, both complete serviceable rifles and also basically scrapped out rifles that were usable only for parts. Finland was able to buy these really quite cheap. So with that in mind, let's start at the very beginning of this rifle's history. Let's find out where this receiver actually came from. All right, with the rifle disassembled, we have the original manufacturing mark right here on the tang. This is 1896 production, and that hammer indicates that it was made at the Tula arsenal in the Russian Empire at that time. And handily, that actually means that this rifle is legally an antique in the United States. Kind of cool. All right, so we know this rifle was made in 1896 in Russia. It then goes into the First World War, as do all of the Mosins that Russia has on hand in service. And this rifle was actually then captured by Austro-Hungarian forces at some point during the war. How do we know that? We know it from this number and from these numbers. Originally, Russian Mosins had their rear sights designated in Artian. And here's a really good example of that, in this case on a Finnish converted M91. The Artian is a unit of measurement equal to 28 inches, and it's what the Russian Empire used. So for them, the rear sight began, ignore this notch, that was added by the Finns, began at 400 Artian and went 4, 6, 8, 10, 1200 Artian. Well, many of the rifles that the Austro-Hungarians captured, they went ahead and actually converted to use their own 8x50mm Mannlicher cartridge. And when they did that conversion, they remarked the rear sight in Schritt, which was the Austrian unit of distance measurement at the time. And so converting with the new unit and the new cartridge, they came out with 2, 3, 4, 5, and 600 Schritt markings for the rear sight. Now we also have this number right here. When the Austro-Hungarians did this rechambering, they gave new serial numbers to the rifles that they were converting to 8x50, and they marked those serial numbers on both the receiver and the barrel, so that when the process, when they were doing the conversion, they'd pull the barrel off, and having them marked with the same serial number allowed them to match the original barrel back onto the original receiver when they were done. They usually then also added a stamp on top of either the receiver or the barrel, indicating the shop or factory that did the conversion work. Now, this whole process was a bit haphazard, so you don't always see all of these marks, but the most common is an OEWG stamp for the factory in Steyr, Austria, that did this conversion work. You will often see that on Finnish Mosin Nagants. That doesn't mean the rifle was captured, well, it means the rifle was captured by the Austro-Hungarians, but more specifically, it means it was actually converted by them to 8x50. Now, some of the shops put that stamp on the barrel, and this has a Finnish barrel on it, which is why we don't see it. It's also why we only have the serial number surviving on the receiver. All right, at this point, we know the rifle was first manufactured at Tula in 1896. It went into World War I, where it was at some point captured by Austro-Hungarian forces, and it was rechambered to 8x50 Mannlicher. And we even actually know what the Austro-Hungarian army did with this rifle, because they went and marked it on the butt plate. Not all Austro-Hungarian small arms were marked like this, but some were, and this particular one is marked 4FR. The arrow there is the manufacturer's stamp for the original Russian factory that did the butt plate. 4FR is the 4th Fortress Artillery Regiment, and there are actually some other Mosin Nagant rifles and bayonets that are known with this same marking. So the serial number is actually Finnish, but the 4FR is an Austro-Hungarian unit mark. So this rifle goes and serves out the rest of World War I with the Austro-Hungarians. At the end of the war, it is turned over to Italy as war reparations. That was a fairly common element of war reparations after World War I, was the transfer of military material. The French, for example, would train for years with German Maxim guns and 8mm Mauser ammo because they got it as war reparations, and it was a lot cheaper to use that for training than expensive ammunition that they had to manufacture themselves. Now, the Italians get these, and they have, well, they ultimately have about 43,000 Mosin Nagant rifles. A bunch of them are in really bad shape, missing bolts, that sort of thing. A lot of the barrels are trashed. A lot of them have been converted like this to 8x50 Mannlicher. Italy doesn't really have any use for these things. It's got its own cartridge. It stays with the Carcano rifle as its standard service rifle. So Italy makes it known that, hey, we've got these rifles available for sale if anyone wants them. Well, Finland hears about this, and in 1926, they send a delegation down to Italy to have a look and see what can be purchased. And the Finns, lo and behold, well, the Finns go in hoping to get rifles with good usable barrels. It turns out not so much of that, especially because of these chamber conversions, but the Finns buy it all up. They get a bunch of Russian Maxim guns as part of the same deal, and they come home with a pile of Mosin Nagant rifles and that are usable either as to be rebarreled or simply just as parts, even if the Finns can only get, a magazine or a trigger or a bolt out of a junked, damaged, rusty, poor condition rifle. Well, that's still worthwhile. Every part they can buy is a part they don't have to make. Our rifle has now arrived in Finland sometime around 1926, and it's going to need a new barrel, because this barrel was in 8x50 Mannlicher, and that is not useful. So the Finnish Civil Guard, since it doesn't have any barrel manufacturing capability of its own yet, it does have Sacco, but Sacco, in 1927, Sacco does not have barrel manufacturing tooling yet, so the Civil Guard buys barrels from Schweizer Industriegesellschaft in Neuhausen, and you may know that better as SIG. They purchased barrels from SIG. They purchased, in fact, about 20,000 barrels, 20,100 barrels, I believe, in 2 separate orders for this M28 rifle project. And we even have it dated down here, 1927, upside down, and it's a little tiny stamp, but this is a SIG barrel from 1927. The rifles and the parts and the barrels all go into Sacco in Riihimäki in Finland, and presto, out come M28 rifles. So we have the gun reassembled now. As part of the manufacturing process, the Finns go ahead and remark the sight on the right side for meters. None of this arshins, none of this Schritt. We're going for actual normal meters. And their caliber and barrel length and sight configuration gives you 300, 400, 550, 700, and 850 for the various steps in the rear sight. The Finns opt to use a significantly heavier profile barrel than the Russians had done. They do that for better accuracy, and they use this distinctive new style of nose cap. The original Russian version here just clamps down on the handguard and the barrel and the stock, and what that means is that if the stock warps, it's going to put pressure on the barrel. Sorry, forgot to put the cleaning rod back in here. What the Finns do is use a one-piece nose cap here that wraps around the handguard and the stock and the barrel, but this screw just holds it onto the stock. So there's no actual pressure being exerted by this system onto the barrel. Now this isn't perfectly free-floated. If the stock warps enough, it could impact your accuracy, but it's a significant step up from the original Russian M91s. Now, in the process of putting on this new barrel, of course, the Austro-Hungarian conversion mark and the Austro-Hungarian serial number are gone. They're on the old barrel that gets thrown out. We have some new markings here from the Finns. Ignore the fact that it is crossed out for the moment, but this is a serial number 3383. Prefix for the early SIG-barreled guns is a lowercase o. But this is one of the very early M28 production rifles, which means it has a number of very early features that were abandoned pretty quickly. It has this windage adjustable rear sight. You've got a little, pretty worn, but a little worm screw in here that allows you to shift the rear sight side to side to zero it for windage. That's a cool feature, but it is complicated and prone to breaking, and the Finns ditched it fairly quickly. The very early M28 rifles also have this distinctive double sling slot in the stock. So of course the slot through the stock is a take from Russian Mosin Nagant use, where the Russians would have a leather collar wrapped through this and then attach the sling to the collars. When designing the M28, the Civil Guard got this idea that it would be cool to have a stock that was more conducive to carrying the rifle across your back while on skis. This fits for Finland. So they designed a different style of sling, and in order to balance the rifle biathlon style, it has 2 slots in the buttstock to properly attach a longer sort of dog collar strap. Well, that got abandoned fairly quickly too, because it's pretty cheap to just reuse a Russian stock that already has a slot in it. It's a lot more work and expense to have to actually add a second slot of your own, so they stopped doing it, but this rifle still has that. So we have an SY marking on top of the barrel. That's Finnish for Civil Guards. And then this would have been, as a matching serial number gun, you've got the full serial number here on the left side of the chamber, and then you would have the last 2 digits on the bolt handle, which they are not. This is a replacement bolt. And you would also have the last 2 digits of the number on the rear of the butt plate, which this one does, 83. So this is the original stock and butt plate for this action. In addition to the serial number, Finnish Civil Guard rifles would also receive a district number. The Civil Guard was made up of a bunch of individual geographical districts, and those essentially had their own serial numbers, like their own unique district serial numbers as well. So this particular rifle was issued to the Kuopio Civil Guard. They had a block of numbers assigned that started at 78,000 and went to 84,000. So that's where this one went. Interestingly, Kuopio was the location of AV3, one of the Finnish Army weapon depots, which actually wouldn't have been working on Civil Guard guns. But really cool that we can also trace this to exactly where the Civil Guard issued it. Now, originally, that Civil Guard number would also have been stamped in full right here on the flat of the bolt. In this case, this is a replacement bolt, and so the old number, because the Russians also marked serial numbers here, the old number has been ground off, and they've given it the last 3 digits of what the Army considered to be the new serial number, 689. We'll get to that in a moment, but that's the explanation for that number. This takes us forward into the 1930s. The gun was made in Russia in 1896. It goes into World War I. It gets captured by the Austro-Hungarians. It gets rechambered to 8x50 Mannlicher. It gets given to Italy as war reparations. It's then purchased by the Finns, rebuilt into an M28. And now we fast forward through to 1939 when the Soviet Union invades Finland and the Winter War begins. When that happens, not surprisingly, all of the small arms in Finland are mobilized into service, and Civil Guard guns go into the fight right alongside Army rifles. And between both the Winter War and the Continuation War, basically by the end of the Continuation War, all of the Civil Guard rifles have been seconded over into Army ownership, and they end up in Army inventory. And that's when we get another batch of markings on the gun. So this SA stamp stands for Finnish Army, and this is something that people associate with like every Finnish military rifle ever, because on the collector's market here in the United States, we see that on basically everything. Well, Civil Guard guns did not originally have this. In fact, this was a marking that was only adopted in 1942. So this tells us that at some point after 1942, this rifle was in Finnish Army inventory, or Finnish Defense Forces inventory. Well, that's kind of obvious. We know that these were all acquired during the Winter War and the Continuation War. Now, when the Army took these guns over, they looked at this plethora of serial numbers and they're like, what even is this? We just want one serial number, thank you. And they had to pick one. And so in many cases, including this one, they opted to keep the Civil Guard district number as the new official Army serial number, because the district number was originally stamped in full right here. So what they did is cross out the original Civil Guard serial number. This is the number that goes onto the Finnish Army inventory books. And this, again, is typical of what we see once these guns are here in the United States. In Finnish service with the Civil Guards, it would have had a serial number and its district number, which tells you where the gun belongs. But the Army had different policies. The Army didn't have districts that it assigned each individual rifle to. At the end of the Continuation War, one of the stipulations of the Allied Control Committee, essentially by the Russians, is that the Finnish Civil Guard be completely dismantled, and it is. All Civil Guard rifles end up becoming Army property, which we see had already occurred on this particular example. And then this rifle goes into storage. It will be in Finnish military reserves for a couple more decades until eventually it's sold to the United States. And we have evidence of that stamped into the rifle as well. We have a very faint import marking up here on the barrel. This was imported by Marathon Products out of Connecticut. Country of origin is marked on there by US law, which is Finland. So that rounds out this rifle's story from Russia to Austria-Hungary to Italy to Finland, to a couple more wars, and then back to Finland, and then on to the United States, where it lives very happily in my own collection now. Personally, I really enjoy looking at firearms like this one that have such detailed individual stories literally written into them that we can trace. I think that's just a really cool thing to be able to look at with a firearm. This is literally history, and we know where it was throughout most of its life, which I think is great. Anyway, the M28 also, for what it's worth, is the rarest pattern of Finnish Mosin Nagant, or at least the least commonly manufactured of the standard infantry rifles. There were only about 33,000 of these made between when they started ordering barrels in 1927 and when they ceased production in 1932. It was replaced by the M2830, most notable for having a much improved rear sight. They would go on to produce a lot more of the 2830s, and that leaves this as sort of this orphan in the middle that only got a few years of production. Just makes it all the cooler. Anyway, if you like Finnish small arms, if you find this sort of thing interesting, you should definitely check out my brand new book, Forged in Snow, Finnish Small Arms, 1917 through 2025. It is currently in pre-sale over on Kickstarter. Lots of cool options, lots of cool stretch goals, and other stuff to check out. So definitely take a look at it. The link is in the description text below. Thanks for watching.